To start, you went into detail about the right of return. What threats do Palestinians face now within the right of return?
Right, I mean, the first and foremost threat, the biggest threat and obstacle to Palestinian return is Israeli violence. That's the first one. The second one is Israeli political pressure on the host Arab governments, right? Whether it's in Egypt, Syria, or Lebanon. And the third threat is the Arab states themselves. Right? And so these are issues that we have to navigate and think about, you know. By the way, we're not relegated. I forgot to say this. We're not relegated to waiting for our so-called leadership to act in diplomatic ways. These are conversations that we can have with communities in Lebanon and Egypt, quasi-state communities. These are engagements we need to feel a sense of ownership in making and discussing with the communities themselves, and even with quasi-diplomatic, quasi-state entities there. So those are the primary first and foremost. The other obstacle is that, you know, all law, international law, even the UN, all of these are, you know, laws are executed by political will or recalcitrance. There's also a lot of political pressure on the UN. First of all, you know, Palestinians have no protection, right? So if we're facing violence, under international law, every refugee is supposed to be given safe passage to their homes, right? There is not a single institution in the world that is dedicated to protecting Palestinian refugees. All of them can treat us as charity. They can all talk about us, but not a single one of them. UNRWA was never given a mandate to protect the Palestinian refugees, right? It was just given a mandate to treat them like refugees, okay? So there's nobody there to protect the Palestinian refugees, and nobody's interested in protecting the Palestinian refugees because there's no political will to do so in the UN or internationally. And that's another thing that, quite frankly, we should be taking up. We are all capable. Right? It's not beyond us. The beautiful thing about Palestinian society, and this is one thing that I love about a lot of, and I've been to many Arab countries, thing about us, actually was the case in Yemen, is the Palestinian society lacks an administrative layer. I mean, this administrative layer is nonsense. إحنا ما بنقدرش نتصرف بلاهم. We don't have this one, which means that we are capable of creating our own quote-unquote administrative layers, right? We can ourselves act as a state. There's nothing stopping us from doing that. And that's what it means to be an activist. If we start thinking and realizing that we actually have the capacity to enter spaces of the UN and to talk to other governments, why not? I don't know if that answered the question. But...
No, absolutely. And that's an incredible point. And as you talk to us here, people living in New Jersey, right across the river from the UN, clearly people who are passionate about Palestinians' right of return and Palestinian liberation, how do you think we can play a role in building power, which is really how you opened up the speech in terms of speaking from a place of power and bravery, and that the impact of that as compared to speaking from a place of weakness and fear? How do you see us, first, building that power, and second, leveraging the power that we already have, but might not be fully exercising to not only contribute to the Palestinian right of return, but to Palestinian liberation overall?
Right. You know, this is actually a conversation that I was having with Dima, and it's not for lack of ideas on how to do that. Actually, we have a lot of ideas on how to do that, and it's not difficult. What's difficult is that we have been forced into a case of constant crisis and reaction, right? This is how our community came into fruition, because we came into being in a constant state of self-defense, right? Because they came and they attacked us, right? We didn't go in with a proactive offensive plan. They came and they attacked us, and they're still attacking us, and we're responding. And I think that first and foremost, what needs to happen, we need, you know, I'll use the example of lawyering, like I was telling Dima earlier, right? For example, what we spend on one case defending against terrorism charges, right? $100,000, $300,000, $400,000. With that money for the defense of one case, we could have hired 3 lawyers for 3 years to defend 10 cases, right? But we're constantly reacting defensively. We haven't set up what needs to happen, and I had proposed this last year at another meeting, is we need to sit down and survey our strengths, our weaknesses across the US first. Our strengths, our weaknesses, what's missing, where's our money going? Is our money best put into constant defense? Is it best put into charity, or do we build something that can come up with proactive, offensive, long-term 5 and 10-year strategies, right? So that way we don't have to keep dumping money into the hole of charity or into the hole of self-defense. This is what needs to happen. Right? This is how you become more powerful. As for the individual, you know, it is my position, and I don't want to take away. Maybe as a lawyer I've had the privilege, but I've struggled. I mean, I've struggled very, very, very much, right? I've struggled a lot. But, you know, people will face losing their employment, and I think everybody, you know, we have access to information. We're aware of the consequences of either choosing to step into our identities and our desires and being honest about our aspirations, or not. I mean, this is a decision that everybody has to make every day, and you have to calculate the pros and the cons, right? Bargaining from a position of power. I'm a litigator. I've been litigating for a very long time. In my history, alhamdulillah, you know, you don't litigate all cases, but you litigate a lot of cases, right? I lost one case that was reversed on appeal. I lost another case because my client really hurt another person, and I lost another case because a judge, it was a very political case, the judge thought Palestine and Georgia were the same country. So, you know, and the one thing that I've learned is you never start by asking for less than what you want. I mean, this is what the madness of what we've seen our leadership do for the past 40 years. I mean, it's the definition of insanity, basic negotiation. When you want to go buy a purse for $100, you know, you start by saying, I want it for $25. Right? So you have to demand the most. Actually, don't just demand Palestinian, and I didn't get to this, Palestinian return, with all due respect. And this I take quite personally, both as a Palestinian and as an attorney. When I go, let's say somebody is suing somebody for hurting them, right? We ask for all damages. All damages be remedied. Pain and suffering and loss of companionship and everything, and out-of-pocket costs. Well, what about the loss to our legacy, right? All of these generations, I might not be in the position that I am in now if Palestine had been different. Same thing goes for you. We should be asking for restitution, reparations, and return. All three of those. And you know what? At the highest amount. And in fact, conditioning any sort of peace settlement on all of them at the same time, with return being first. وبعدين بنحكي على الباقي.
And I think that's an awesome point that really goes into how you spoke before about how we shouldn't be putting the Palestinian right of return in a footnote. We should really be demanding everything that the Palestinian people, have a right to and more. And I'm saying we, but I'm ethnically Tunisian, which I'll go into in a second in terms of other Arab allyship. But can you kind of go a bit into detail more about how relegating the right of return to a footnote has been done, and how it is we can challenge that rhetoric now?
Well, I think I answered that question a few times, and I think I just answered it now. So maybe to avoid being redundant, I won't talk about that. But I do want to talk about maybe a little bit about the other models of return that have been successful and maybe perhaps failed. One model, you know, everybody talks about, oh, let's talk about two states and a binational state. I find that tremendously offensive. Because this really entrenches the segregated nature of communities. And the Palestinian people, the people of the land called Palestine, up until Israel, did not operate in such segregated ways. And that's an offense not just to Palestinians, but to the whole of humanity. Because I just told you, we have Muslim, Christian, and Jewish Zionists, just like we have Muslim, Christian, Jewish, non-Zionists. The idea of, you know, continuing the segregation in any form, to me, is unacceptable. But that's neither here nor there. But in Bosnia, for example, when they were talking about repatriating and resolving the conflict, the first thing, again, that they addressed was the return of the refugees. And actually, specifically to undo the segregation that was caused by the forces there, the first thing they said is, before we could talk about restitution, let's get everybody back to their houses so we don't have communities segregated by religion. That's one example, right? They made restitution a condition of return to the original homes and lands, which is the language of every international law and human law that addresses the right of somebody to go back to their home, number one. There was another beautiful example of Guatemala. In Guatemala, a lot of factions were fighting to come back home, and the only faction that was very successful in making sure that all of its demands were met was the faction that included return, restitution, and reparations in its own factional constitution, number one, and refused to put down its arms until all of its conditions were met, and it was the only faction who had every single one of their conditions met, right? So all of them. You look at the case of South Africa, nos. South Africa, we talk, 70 years, my God. The great thing about the Palestinians having come into the age, our issue coming into the age of the UN is, who's preserved the records of Palestinian refugees and has them accessible? The UN itself, UNRWA. Yeah, it was great for charity. It didn't do much else for the Palestinians. It kept them alive. But it is a source of all of the records that prove Palestinians' right to return, how they return, where they return home, right? So it's all there, right? So, South Africa didn't have the wealth of records that we have, right? And they reached back 80 years and they said, all of it and reparations. But South Africa made a big mistake. South Africa paid for reparations out of its own pockets. And now you still see that the white farmers and the white landowners still own the majority of the wealth in South Africa. And that's why there's now, how many years later, a move to redistribute property. So why should we wait another 80 years to fix that mistake? We should be looking at that for another example. Does that answer? Is that good? Yeah?
Absolutely, thank you. The last question I want to ask before we open it up to the audience is, in the beginning you also spoke about how one of the biggest threats to Palestinians' right of return are Arab states. And I know by quick look into the audience, how many non-Palestinians are here? Okay, which is a good chunk, alhamdulillah. Awesome. And so there are a number of us who are coming in as allies, myself included. How is it that you see we can leverage our power and our capacities to not only be effective allies for Palestinians, but also to keep from liquidating the movement for Palestine internally? You spoke about this, so did Dr. Abu Rashid, in terms of Zionist organizers and institutions really trying to penetrate our communities and get us from within, so pit us against each other, using us in op-eds as non-Palestinian Muslims, putting us in pictures and saying, look, we're not Islamophobic, we're not anti-Arab, it's the problems in the Palestinians themselves because we're friends with everybody else. So how can we be aware and cognizant of those strategies to keep ourselves from being used in them, and then how can we also counter them and be more proactive?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand your question about aware and cognizant of what strategy.
How can we be, so to give more practical examples,
one
challenge that a lot of organizers here in New Jersey face, Muslim organizers, is that Zionist institutions often reach out to us to build collaborations with us, and it's almost always the institutions with no Palestinians on the board. And very often, those Muslim organizations and institutions will fall into those traps because they don't know what's going on. It's usually in the guise of like interfaith building or whatever it is. How can we be aware of those? What resources are there for us not to fall into those traps and be used in those like op-eds, those pictures, those strategies to liquidate our movements?
Okay, so I think I want to start with a couple of things. First of all, I don't think that the people who are being tricked into engaging in collaboration with Zionist groups are not aware that who they're dealing with are Zionist groups. And if they are, then that's just for a gross lack of due diligence, because all it takes is a Google search to find out who you're dealing with. So maybe we'll start with there. If there's any group that you haven't heard of, research them. I'm a member of Majlis al-Shura of New York. Majlis al-Shura executive director, former executive director, Sheikh Ahmed Mbarak, brilliant man, actually. And in fact, Majlis al-Shura of New York, I think, is the first Majlis al-Shura to adopt BDS as one of its points of unity. And as Sheikh, his name is actual Sheikh Ahmed Mbarak, came into the leadership of Majlis al-Shura, the first thing that he did was say, I want people who can research every group that I'm ever going to deal with. And so he would just send an email to a bunch of us and say, who are these people? And we would say, oh, hold on. This is what they do, and this is their role in promoting Islamophobia. So first of all, we need to be diligent about who we work with. Second of all, it's important to understand what we discussed earlier. One great thing, many great things about the Tunisian revolution, but one particularly noble thing, and we saw this from people throughout the Arab Spring, or let's call it the first phase of the Arab Spring, is that the Tunisians, I don't know if you folks here know, but the Tunisians actually proposed that the liberation of Palestine be in its constitution. Yeah. Now, do you think, I mean, certainly the Tunisians and Algerians love us, right? For good reason, but do you think that it was purely selfless that they wanted the Palestinians, the liberation of Palestine? No, because it's a direct threat. Maintaining Israel, we go back to what I said. If you're going to keep Palestinians oppressed, well, then you have to have cause for oppressing and dehumanizing and subjugating all of the people who look and sound and think and care about the Palestinians. So what threatens us will always and forever threaten you, right? Just like in Egypt. You know, they started Al-Quds Rayhin Shuhada bil Mayadin, the first 2, 3, 4 weeks of the Egyptian revolution, and guess what? Then everybody was terrified. Israel is coming for us. Imagine that the democratic will of 80 million people is subverted by this threat called Israel. Everybody's so afraid. We're afraid of going into revolutions. I mean, it's that direct, and we have to start thinking about it. With all due respect to all of the Arabs and allies in this room, it is not, you helping us is not doing us a favor. And I always tell people, I'm sorry, we really don't need your help. Actually, just you tell your people to stop helping Israel and we'll be okay. 3.5 billion to their 19.7 billion, ومش قادرين علينا. We'll be okay. It is actually in your interest, allies and neighbors and Muslims and Christians and Arabs. It is your interest and your safety that is at stake so long as Palestine is not liberated. So it's not, don't feel sorry for us. We'll be okay.
Awesome. And thank you, Lamis.